Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to speak about the linguistic evidence for or against the Aryan Invasion Theory. And ultimately this is a linguistic issue. In 2017 there was some commotion in the Indian media that genetics has proven the Aryan Invasion Theory. The secularists were all jubilating. But in fact, if you say genetics has proven the Aryan Invasion Theory, you have only shown that you just simply don't understand what this whole debate is about. You see, genetics may prove migrations, they may show the movement of a specific type of people, what they used to call a race. Nowadays it's a genetic group or something. But it doesn't show the movement of people. In India, a lot of people have come in, and yet none of them has kept his language. The Scythians have come in, the Huns have come in, the Kushanas have come in, the Greeks have come in, the Turks, the Afghans, then Parsi refugees have come in, Syrian Christian refugees have come in, and so on. And linguistically, they have all of them assimilated. Even if they were politically in a very strong position, even if they were motivated by an ideology that justified separatism, nevertheless, they have all assimilated linguistically. And so what we're talking about here is the migration of languages. And so if people immigrate but don't leave a trace in the linguistic landscape, then it is another phenomenon than the one we are discussing here. Here we are discussing the immigration of a language. The Indo-European language, the Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-European language family, is said to have immigrated into India. Now, this may have been by an immigration, and in those days that was the most probable scenario, but it may also have been that the Indians, for some reason, took an internet course in Indo-European and converted and dropped their native language and became Indo-European speaking. You see, that is also the immigration of a language, though not the immigration of a people. And so we will keep the discussion of physical immigrations by people for another occasion. What we are discussing now is the movement of languages. And so particularly of the Indo-European language family. What is this? It is the grouping, because of common characteristics, of most of the European languages with most of the Indian languages and the Iranian languages in between. So these languages are they are branches, if you want, of the Indo-European family. They are Germanic, to which English and German belong, Celtic, Italic, to which Latin belongs, and then it evolutes French, Spanish, and so on, Baltic, Slavic with Russian, Albanian, Greek, Armenian, Iranian, and Indo-Aryan. Indo-Aryan with Sanskrit, Hindi, Bengali, and the rest. Some branches also have existed and are known but are extinct. Mainly Anatolian, of which most important is Hittite. Then Tocharian. Hittite was spoken in what is now Turkey, Tocharian in what is now the west of the Chinese People's Republic. Then Thracian and Phrygian, spoken in Bulgaria and Anatolia. And then most importantly perhaps Proto Bongani. Proto Bongani is a substrate. The original language has disappeared, but some words survive as a substrate in the Bongani language, which is spoken in India in the foothills of the Himalaya. The connection between some Indian and some European languages was first realized by a British Jesuit called Thomas Stephens in 1583, and very shortly thereafter by an Italian traveling businessman, Filippo Sassetti, in 1585. It was already a little bit systematized by Marcus Zuerius van Boxhorn, a Dutch traveler in 1647. However, the official recognition started with the 3rd anniversary speech or lecture of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1786 in Kolkata by William Jones, because he used a little bit odd word philologer rather than the more usual form philologist. This is usually known as the philologer lecture. So he discovered the unity or the kinship between Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Gothic, and Celtic, to which later also other languages were added, Slavic, Baltic, then later when it was discovered, Hittite, Tocharian. And so when this language construct became better known, a Frenchman gave the name Indo-Germanique to it, which was later translated by Heinrich Julius von Klaproth in the more famous term Indo-Germanisch, which is still the name in German. Otherwise, most languages follow the English original by Thomas Young in 1813, which is Indo-European. And we also will call this language family the Indo-European languages. About the homeland, the first homeland that people thought of was India. And so they assumed that the homeland had been India, and from there the European languages had ultimately come. This was already thought of before the Indo-European language family was known. In the 18th century, Voltaire and the philosopher Immanuel Kant already had an inkling that European civilization owed much to India. Even though they had no exact linguistic view or no view specifically of the linguistic aspect of that kinship, they did think that rather than in the Bible, Europe should look for its roots in India. So that, in fact, was the out of India theory, although people didn't use that term yet. And so that was the first homeland theory, the out of India theory. Nowadays, people want to tell you that it's a strange, bizarre, eccentric invention or concoction by vicious, ugly Hindu fundamentalists. That is not true. It was thought of by Europeans, and it was thought up some 240 years ago. However, in the years 1820 to ultimately 1850, it gradually went out of favor. But meanwhile, many things happened. Indo-European scholarship as a discipline started, or Orientalism, started in 1816, birth year of Orientalism, note down. With the work of Franz Bopp, who compared the grammar of Sanskrit with the grammar of Greek and Latin. He started with the conjugation of the nouns and then later all the other aspects of grammar. And so that comparative method is then developed, and so these languages are all found to satisfy a certain commonality of pattern. And so he starts reconstructing what should have been the original form, the form that explains all the attested later forms in the different daughter languages. Now this reconstruction, you should understand, it is not exact. many linguists take their own findings too seriously, take their own reconstructions too literally. So the fact is, these reconstructions have to be good enough to explain the daughter forms, but we should at every moment realize that this is only an approximation. We have thought this up, this more or less works, but we cannot pretend anything more than that. We do not know what the language originally sounded like. Nowadays there are a few websites where they actually use Indo-European as a language. And so that's an interesting game to play, but we have to remain aware that it's only a game and that ultimately we don't really know what Indo-European looked like. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is to deny that any reconstruction at all is possible, that this is a ghost language, as some skeptics here in India assume. Then later in the 19th century, another important name is August Schleicher. You see, most of these first Orientalists were all Germans, which is interesting because Edward Said has launched a theory thoroughly blackening the word Orientalist, which simply is the name of someone practicing the discipline of Oriental history and philology, as it is called. I have a diploma of Oriental history and philology. And so he thoroughly blackened it. He said that all those scholars studying Sanskrit and other Oriental languages were all agents of the colonial enterprise. Now, in the case of Germany, that is already very old because Germany and all the Central European countries, the Austrian Empire, and others, they did not have colonial possessions in Asia. They had no colonial enterprise there. They had no political use for studying Sanskrit or Chinese or Arabic. So what those scholars were doing was out of lust of knowing, as a British critic, Robert Irwin, has written. It is out of lust of knowing that they started studying all these funny languages. Like we recently had a conference about Dimitrios Galanos, who is Greek. He became an Orientalist. He studied Sanskrit and many other languages, Persian and many languages from India or known in India, while staying for 46 years continuously in India, 40 years in Varanasi, and studying all at the feet of Pandits, thoroughly traditional. And he was not at all a member of a colonial society. On the contrary, he came from Greece, which at that time was not even independent. Greece itself was colonized by an Oriental empire, the Ottoman Empire. So you see, this whole politicization of the word Orientalism by Edward Said goes nowhere and it flies in the face of the facts. Now, August Schleicher was one of those German Orientalists. He started the vogue of identifying the original people who spoke Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European as a nation, the Indo-Germanisches Urvolk, the primeval nation of the Indo-Europeans. That idea has gone out of fashion. You see, we don't know what kind of society this was. Did they feel like a unit? You see, quite possibly, if the situation in other tribes is anything to go by, there was a continuum of tribes more or less related that spoke a language more or less the same. And that's about all we can say. So in the 19th century, they tended to take this term Urvolk too seriously. And there was a lot of myth-making about an Indo-European nation. He also thought that there was a polygenesis of languages. This means that he did not think that all languages came from one language. Now, probably he was just not ambitious enough. If you go back 5,000 or 10,000 years in the past, you have quite a few languages. You have Proto-Uralic, you have Proto-Indo-European, you have Proto-Sino-Tibetan, and so on, but you still have a multiplicity. However, if you go back 70,000 years, then you come a lot closer to unity. And nowadays, there are scholars who say, well, yes, there was originally one language. Humanity started as one tribe, a few hundred people, not more, and they all understood one another. And indeed, they say, in the languages all over the world, you can still identify some 40 roots that are the same, or that are present, that are equally present in more or less all languages. Like the word milk, for example, from a root milk, that in many languages means either milk or sucking or throat, ultimately deriving from a descriptive term for the act of suckling by a baby at the mother's breast. So there are about 40 roots like that. They will not be much help if in a foreign country you seek to speak the language. And so it's an interesting theoretical construct, but for all practical purposes, it is more useful to take August Schleicher's position and say that at least in the recent past, there was a multiplicity already of proto-languages. And one of these was Proto-Indo-European, spoken some 6,000 years ago. Interesting is also that he thought of languages as living entities that had their birth, then grew to maturity, and later decayed. That's an idea that started with Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was a German philosopher in the beginning of the 19th century. He had that idea already before Darwin launched the evolution theory. But so in fact it is a precursor of the evolution theory. The name Schleicher is mostly known among Indo-Europeanists because he was the first one to write a story in Indo-European, as he thought he had reconstructed it. So it is about avis aquasas ka. Avis, you can maybe recognize the Latin word ovis, which is related to the English word ewe, which means a female sheep. So it's a sheep. Aquasas ka. The ka is Sanskrit cha, or is Greek kai, which means and. It's about the sheep and the aquas, the horse. Aqua is ashva, Latin equus, Sanskrit ashva. So it's a fable about the sheep and the horse. And so he gives this fable. It's only a few paragraphs. And if you read it, it is very much like Sanskrit. At that time, they still thought that Indo-European was more or less Sanskrit. And so that is also why the first Orientalists thought that India was the homeland. They made a not entirely accurate deduction. They thought if the homeland was in India, then the original language must have been Sanskrit or something like it. And vice versa. If Sanskrit was the ancestral language, then the homeland must have been in India. However, with linguistic discoveries, they started seeing that there must have been quite a distance still between Sanskrit and the original reconstructed Proto-Indo-European. And so, again, not very accurately, they deduced that then the homeland must also be at some distance from India. And so that's when they started moving the homeland out of India to more westerly parts. Yes, here we have that story. In English it is translated, a sheep that had no wool, meaning a shorn sheep, saw horses, one of them pulling a heavy wagon, one carrying a big load, and one carrying a man quickly. That is to say, the man was riding the horse. The sheep said to the horses, "My heart pains me seeing a man driving horses." The horses said, "Listen, sheep, our hearts pain us when we see this. A man, the master, makes the wool of the sheep into a warm garment for himself, and the sheep has no wool." Having heard this, the sheep fled into the plain. So that is the story. There are newer versions of it. I don't know if this makes sense to you. Gewois equals kwe. That's the same title, the sheep and the horse. And so you have newer versions of what reconstructed Indo-European must have looked like. And so there are newer versions of the fable. Anyway, so what he launched was the Stammbaum theory. That is to say, the theory that the languages were related to one another like the branches in a genealogical tree. So initially you had Indo-European, then you had branches, namely Indo-Aryan, Latin or Italic, Germanic, and so on. And then those branches themselves branched out into more members. Germanic became North Germanic, East Germanic, West Germanic. West Germanic in turn became English, Frisian, Dutch, and German. And so you see this was all branching like a genealogical tree. Against that, Johannes Schmidt, his contemporary, wrote a bit later in 1872 of the Wellen theory, which was the theory of the waves. And that was about the influence of one language upon another. So these two elements are there. People speak like what they have learned from their parents. So there is an inertial influence that makes the language not too different from the ancestral language. At the same time, there is to some extent a sideways influx of words or other characteristics borrowed from other languages. And so those influences transmit themselves from language to language like a wave. So that is true, these two influences are there, but they are not equal. The Stammbaum, the genealogical tree, is primary, and the waves are secondary. So these linguistic developments led to the Aryan Invasion Theory, or rather to the establishment of a more westerly homeland, which from the Indian viewpoint, but that was not the viewpoint of those scholars, they were writing in Europe, not in India, but so from the Indian viewpoint that became the Aryan Invasion Theory. Aryan at that time was also one of the words used for Indo-European. And so they thought, well, since Indo-European is present in India through Sanskrit and also present in Europe, it must have come from Europe to India through an invasion. And you see, in a way, this is totally common sense. If the language is present both in India and in Europe, it has either come from Europe to India or from India to Europe. So where in the West the homeland was that was disputed was initially Bactria, which is Afghanistan, which is not far from India, but then it later became the Balkans or Russia or Anatolia or Germany, or even there was a theory that said it was Atlantis. This was the homeland. Why not? Since the 1920s, there has been a growing consensus that it must have been in southwestern Russia, northeast of the Black Sea, north of the Caspian Sea. Indians tend to identify this viewpoint with the person of Friedrich Max Müller. In fact, Max Müller, he was a German who got employed in England, and so he brought with him a lot of the theorizing that had been developed by German scholars who had totally innocently of politics developed their linguistic insights. It is only later that British administrators saw the usefulness of this idea of an Indo-European language family. So how, for example, they could say to Indians, you shouldn't consider us as invaders, as colonizers. We are doing the same as what you have done. You have come into India long ago, and we are doing the same thing. That's, for instance, one of the uses they could make of it. Another use was they could pit Indians against one another. You over there, you are natives, and you over there, you are Aryan invaders. So that was another bone of contention. So that was all useful to the colonial project, but that came much later. It is ridiculous to say that the British had concocted the Aryan Invasion Theory. You see, that was totally innocently thought up and then later employed in the colonial project. So the map you see very often has a dark spot in the Pontic area, which is northeast of the Black Sea, north of the Caspian Sea, and then a whole lot of arrows westward, eastward, northward, southward. And so in that model, the Indo-European languages have spread in all directions. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why many scholars tend to accept it. It seems so logical to have the homeland precisely in the middle, halfway between, on the western side, Portugal, Ireland, Iceland, and on the eastern side, Sri Lanka, Bengal, Assam, and Xinjiang, where Tocharian is spoken. So just about halfway between them, you have these Pontic steppes. Well, that is interesting, but that is very unusual. If you look at languages that have had a great expansion, you see that none of them has started in the middle. They all start at one far end of their area of expansion. Like the Bantu languages have started in northwestern Africa and have conquered practically all of Africa. But that means that they have moved only in the southeastern direction, down to South Africa. Why have they only moved in one direction and not in the other? Well, in the other direction, north of where they started, was the Sahara Desert. Now, the secret of their demographic success was that they started practicing agriculture, which is very profitable. You can keep more children alive. You can better control your own food supply. But to do that, you need soil. You need fertile soil. Now, you don't have that in the desert. So they migrated to the southeast. They did not migrate to the north. Their migration was very anti-symmetrical. And so that is what happens most of the times. Russian started in what is now Ukraine and moved all the way east, 11 time zones, all the way to Alaska. And they did not move west. Now, the Russians were free to move west, but then they would find Germany and Poland and other countries. They would settle there and they would assimilate. And they would no longer be Russians, and they would no longer speak Russian. So the circumstances were asymmetrical, and therefore their pattern of migration, or of the migration of their language at least, was asymmetrical. That is the usual scenario. And so if Indo-European started in the middle, that is not impossible, but it is very unlikely. Statistically, it would be very exceptional. Oh yes, and there's a second reason why to Europeans this scenario with a homeland in Russia seems logical. We do know of a migration of a population that later at any rate spoke Indo-European languages coming from Russia, from a place identified as Yamna, which is not far from the Ural Mountains. And so that immigration spectacularly took place in the 3rd millennium BC. And in Central Europe, you see a completely new type of pottery, new archaeology, you see new genes. In fact, the local population was almost completely replaced by the incoming population. So either they fled massively or they were killed massively. But at any rate, it was an enormous event. For those times, it was a world war, so to speak. It was spectacular. Now, that is what an Aryan invasion theory looks like, or what an Aryan invasion looks like. That's precisely what is missing in India. In India, you never have such spectacular events. But you see, seeing from Europe, you do have a population coming in from Russia. And so you might think, yes, Russia is the land of origin. Well, yes, Russia is the land of origin of that particular immigration, that westward migration. But that doesn't say that it was the original country where from the people of India came from. On the contrary, it may well be that this Yamna was only a secondary origin, that it was a center that was created by people who had earlier migrated all the way from Bactria or even from India. And so there I would say that the scholars were not very careful in their deductions. Then there is also the fact, I mean, this pleads against the Russian homeland, that India happens to be a demographic giant. No other member country, so to speak, of the Indo-European expanse is such a demographic giant. You see, this means that in India, if an immigration comes, it is easily absorbed. And that's indeed historically what we have seen happening. The Scythians, the Kushanas, the Greeks, the Turks, and so on, they were all absorbed, at least linguistically. Conversely, emigrant groups will very easily linguistically dominate the languages in which they move. If in India there was a famine, or there was a political crisis, or any other reason why people would flee, then that little group of Indians that fled, they may have been only 1% of the Indian population, suddenly became like 40% when they came in Central Asia. They were a small group, relatively, in India, but they became a big group, relatively speaking, when they came in Central Asia. So it is just common sense. You see, it is just logical that an Indian population would have such an impact. So much too much is made of the relation between linguistics and genetics. Nevertheless, it has some importance. You see, to explain the movement of a language, at least to some extent there should be a population movement. Because in those days they didn't have internet courses. And in fact, even today when there are internet courses, very few people will change their mother tongue because of a language they learned on the internet. So it's more logical that people move and they take their language. But let's start our examples with a group of migrants that did not speak a language, namely the cows. It turns out that among the cows in Ukraine, there is a strong genetic component of Indian cows. They partly descend from Indian cows. Now, how do the cows from India end up in Ukraine? You see, this means that they have to cross the mountain passes, the Khyber Pass, which cows normally don't do. You see, cows are very quiet and inertial animals. They stay in more or less the same climate if they can. They are not going to brave the very wintry circumstances in Afghanistan before they can come down again to Russia and to Ukraine. They would only do that because people drive them to do it. And indeed it is logical that cowherds from India would take their cattle with them if they emigrated towards Russia. So these Ukrainian cows paradoxically indicate a human migration from India to Ukraine. Now, generally speaking, if you find these genes, you don't have much yet because genes don't speak. And you don't know what language they spoke or what happened to their language. Did they, while moving, impose their language, or did they drop their language and assimilate? We don't know. So in India it has been found that 17% of the males descend from immigrants. And so this is the finding that made some secularists jubilate. Oh, you see, genetics has proven the Aryan invasion. Well, no such thing. You see, those 17%, who are they? Well, they are the Scythians, they are the Greeks, the Turks, and so on, who came to India and who did not impose their language, who instead assimilated into the Indian languages. So similarly, if there had been an immigration like 4,000 years ago, chances are that that is not the Aryan invasion, because very probably they also dropped their language and assimilated with whatever they found in India. Now let's go to more linguistic evidence proper. Sanskrit holds a special place among the Indo-European languages. And maybe it is not the same as Proto-Indo-European, but still it is very close. Like grammatically, it has all the features that Proto-Indo-European is supposed to have had. It has 8 cases. It has 3 numbers, singular, dual, and plural. It has an enormous richness of forms, but it has something even more special. It has what the Greek Sanskritist Nicholas Kazanas calls organic coherence. That is to say, the words in Sanskrit can all be derived from some 2,000 roots or dhatus. This is much more the case in Sanskrit than in the other languages. In fact, this idea came to Sri Aurobindo already 100 years ago in his book Secret of the Veda. He gives only one example in passing, namely vrka, which is the wolf, but it is also the root of a verb meaning to tear. And so it means the wolf is not just a name tag you put on a certain kind of animal. No, it means specifically something, the terror. Now, when I read that, I was struck, I saw the importance of this finding. Maybe it says something about me that I didn't do much with it. I signaled it in my book, Update on the Aryan Invasion Debate, already 20 years old. And I gave a few more examples that I thought up, quickly like that. Like, for example, all the Indo-European languages have a word for name, nama. But only Sanskrit can derive that word nama from a more fundamental root. Namely, it is a derived form from the root nam, which we find in the verb namami. Namami means to address, to greet. Like you find it back in the common greeting, namaste. So there were a few like that, I jotted them down and then I didn't give any thought to it anymore. Fortunately, Nicholas Kazanas, 20 years later, which is a few years ago, came up with a list of 300 to 400 such roots present in Sanskrit. For example, you have a root an, which means breath. You find it, for example, in the composite word or the derivative word prana, which is pra plus an. Forward breathing, literally speaking. So the process of breathing, prana. Now, other Indo-European languages have derivatives, like anemos in Greek means the wind, or anima in Latin means the soul. But you don't have a verb, anare or anemi or something. You only have the derivative. Whereas in Sanskrit, you have a complete set of words, basic words, as well as derivatives. Similarly, you have a Sanskrit word dugdha, which means milk, and then a derivative dughitar means the one who milks, the milkmaid, which means daughter. Now, in all the other Indo-European languages, like dochter in Iranian or daughter in English, you only have the word for daughter, and it doesn't have any connections within the language. So the basic root has gone, only the derivative remains. Similarly, you have a word son, Sanskrit sunu. Now, in Sanskrit, this has been derived from a still existing verbal root, su, which means to procreate, has disappeared in English. Or father, most of the languages have the word father, but only only Indo-Aryan, or specifically Sanskrit, can still derive the word from a verbal root. Pa, which means to protect. So pater, which becomes pita in Sanskrit, means the protector. Or, for example, an important example, sar, which means to flow, or to move fast, to leap, but specifically to flow as in a stream, is the root of the derivative Saraswati. Saraswati is the name of a river, as you know. Now, in Iranian, you have the same word, except with certain changes, phonetic changes, that are typical for the relation between Iranian and Sanskrit. Sanskrit S becomes Iranian H, so you have Harahwaiti. And Harahwaiti is also the name of a river in Afghanistan. But in Iranian, there is only that name of the river, Harahwaiti. It has no relations. Whereas in Sanskrit, Saraswati comes from the verb sar, sarati, and so on. And so that has a whole conjugation that has other derivatives. Saraswati is part of a family. It has organic coherence. So that shows at the very least that Sanskrit is very close to Proto-Indo-European. It has some phonetic changes, but otherwise it is practically the same. Then you have a number of loan words. That's another important area of interest for linguistics. It is sometimes said, yes, India must be an area of expansion, cannot be the original area, because you have a very vast territory speaking variations of a single branch, which is Indo-Aryan. This is spoken by, well, 600-700 million people. That's a lot. That's more than the total number of inhabitants of Europe, with all their different languages. Yes, but that can be explained. You see, all the Indian dialects remained in contact with one another. North India mostly is a plain. You can easily go from one place to another. It is also totally full of rivers. And not mountain rivers, but you see quiet rivers on which you can sail a boat. So you can easily go from Kanpur to Calcutta or so, and just following the river. And so these branches didn't grow too much apart because they were steadily in contact with one another. By contrast, Europe is cut into pieces. You have the Adriatic Sea, you have the Alps, and other mountain ranges. So that is more fragmented, and linguistically it is also more fragmented. But then there is a second reason that explains this. You see, suppose originally, before Indo-European came, Europe was divided in a number of linguistic areas, speaking different languages. Then this more or less united Indo-European comes in, but what happens? In one country, Indo-European fuses, so to speak, with the local language, takes over a number of characteristics from the local language. The same Indo-European goes to another country and there fuses with a different language, takes over characteristics from that other language, borrows different words. So these languages grow apart very fast because they unite with different substrate languages. So that explains it. The loan pattern can also be very interesting. For example, you see that Uralic languages, like Finnish, Hungarian, and so on, spoken originally in the Ural area, they have many hundreds of loanwords from Iranian, a few in fact also from Indo-Aryan, but mostly from Iranian. And the other way around, we don't know of any. Iranian, as we know it, has not borrowed anything from Uralic. So what you get here is a typical colonial situation. The heartland of Irania was Afghanistan, then later on also Iran. And from there, a number of emigrants went to the Uralic territory as overlords. They conquered it. And so they influenced the local languages, but they didn't take the influence in the other direction, if at all there was any. They didn't take it to their heartland, to Afghanistan and so on, where Iranian remained entirely free of Uralic influences. So that says something about what happened. You see, the Indic and Iranian languages were in a dominant position, also for numerical reasons. They were with so many that they could easily overpower another group, but also culturally. Coming from the Harappan culture, you see they had a big technological and cultural advantage. So they very easily dominated local populations. And that's what the Iranians did with the Uralic people. It's not the other way around. Suppose that they all came from a Russian homeland, then they would have had to go through Uralic territory before coming to Afghanistan and India. Then they would probably have brought along a number of borrowed words from Uralic. And that's not the case. So that is an indication that there was no eastward migration from Western Russia. Rather, there was a westward migration from Iran, Afghanistan towards Russia. Yes, here you should be very careful. I have here before me a picture, and I hope you are seated carefully, comfortably and firmly, because you have probably never ever seen so far the face of the devil. Now, I have the face of the devil here before me. It is someone whose name in India is always uttered only with contempt and abhorrence, namely Michael Witzel. Actually, Michael Witzel is German, but he works in Harvard. And so in Indian, anti-Aryan invasion circles, He's a name that is spoken only in certain tones. Well, you see, I met Michael Witzel a few times, and I'd say he's a jolly good fellow. Only on Indo-European migrations we have a difference of opinion. And so he's a strong champion of the Aryan invasion. And in this connection he says, well, you see, Sanskrit was foreign to India. It came with an invasion. And when it came in India, it found a few languages there. And it shows signs of having borrowed from those languages. And there are a few candidates. You see, Dravidian is here, Munda, but also you have Kusunda, which is a language in Nepal that has now disappeared. You have Nahali, which was a big tribal language in central western India. Now it's only very small, it still exists. You have Munda, spoken in east central India now, but at that time maybe it was spoken in the Harappan cities, who knows? So those are possibilities, but even before they came into India, the Sanskrit speakers, they also met in Afghanistan the people of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, which was spoken there in Afghanistan. Of course, it's unattested. We have no writings from those people. And so, in fact, Witzel only presupposes that they had a language of their own from which Sanskrit borrowed. For example, there is the word Ishtaka, which means brick. And so if you assume that the Aryans were barbarians who didn't have houses of stone, and then they found, you see, houses made of bricks, then probably they would have borrowed the word for brick. So that's logical in that scenario that they borrow the word Ishtaka. However, as Shrikant Talageri has shown, the word Ishtaka is not present in the ancient Vedas. It is only in the late Vedic literature that it appears. Now, if they came into India having just learned the word Ishtaka, it is not likely that for centuries they would again forget about it, and then after centuries revive it. That's not logical. More logical would be that they did not have it while in India. That's why the early Vedas don't mention it. Then they develop it in India, and this is the time when the Harappan cities start, 2600 thereabouts. And then they take it to Afghanistan when they emigrate, and so that's why in Afghanistan you also have that word. Another word that they use is a parsha. Parsha means a sheaf, which means a heap of corn. And that word, unfortunately for Witzel, is not from some special Bactrian language. It is just an Indo-European word, and we find it also in Greek, Perse, which means a sheaf. Like the goddess Persephone means literally she who beats the sheaves. Then a second group which he identifies among Vedic words is what he calls Paramunda. That is to say, these words have not been identified in any Munda language. Munda is, for instance, Santali, spoken in Chotanagpur in Jharkhand. It's now also an official language. But so it's a tribal language of origin. And so that group of languages is supposed to have been spoken long ago, even in Western India, and be the source of words in Vedic. Now, he calls it Paramunda because the words have not been attested in Munda, but the structure of the words is the same. For example, you have the Vedic word Kumara. Kumara, a young man. And so he says, well, it may be a composite or a derivative from a root Mara and a prefix Ku. And these prefixes Ka, Ki, Ku are very common in Munda languages. So possibly This is a borrowed word from a Paramunda language. To that I would say, well, why not? Of course, you see, there was constant borrowing, so why not? You see, this was an adstratal influence, that is to say they were neighboring languages. And of course, then some borrowing takes place. Just like in Munda languages, you have Sanskrit words also, or Indo-Aryan words. So that is not problematic. You have the borrowing of words, or you have the absence of borrowing, where you would have expected borrowing. Suppose that Sanskrit had come into India. Then the normal pattern would be that all the names of the rivers in the country they settled were borrowed words, because these rivers already had names with the local population. Like in America, you have the Mississippi River. That's a Native American term, that's not an English term. Now, this is not the case. In North India, you all have Sanskrit river names. So that is strange, unless Sanskrit was the original language there. Interesting also is that even Witzel, a partisan of the Aryan invasion, finds no Dravidian words in ancient Vedic. Then later you see more and more come in, especially as the Indo-Aryans spread out towards the south. They conquer Gujarat, which must have been probably Dravidian speaking originally. But so the Harappan heartland, Punjab, Haryana, was certainly not Dravidian speaking. Maybe it was Paramunda speaking, perhaps, but it was certainly not Dravidian speaking. So all those people in Tamil Nadu and so on who say, oh yes, you see, Harappa was stolen from us and the Harappan language is Dravidian and we can decipher it as some kind of Tamil, well, they are mistaken. Dravidian was certainly not the language there. Even if Sanskrit invaded, you see, it encountered something else than Dravidian. In 1859, the Swiss linguist Adolphe Pictet, he thought up another discipline called Linguistic Paleontology, which means finding out the words in the most ancient form of the language and deducing therefrom what kind of landscape, what kind of circumstances those people must have lived in. For example, he made much of the word fagus in Latin, which means beech. Beech is a kind of a tree. In my country, they are all over the place. Forests, there are many forests that are just entirely beech trees. But in India, you don't find them at all. Now, it is therefore not surprising that this word only exists in West European languages. Of course, because in India, there are no trees to which you could give this name. Therefore, Adolphe Pictet made a mistake when he deduced, the homeland must have been in Western Europe, because this Western European tree name is attested in Indo-European and not in the Eastern languages, only in the Western languages of Indo-European. Well, no, that was an illogical deduction. Moreover, it is generally not true. Like, for instance, a number of words have been found that led to the deduction it must have been in a cold climate, because you had the word wolf, the word bear, the word lynx. You see, cold climate animals. However, hot countries also have zones of cold climate, namely the mountains. And so in Kashmir you find pretty much the same type of flora and fauna as in Europe. Like you have the birch tree, bhurj. You have the birch tree in Kashmir just like you find it in England and Germany and so on. You have wolves in India, you have bears in India, you know. If you can't go into nature to see them, then at least read the Jungle Books by Rudyard Kipling. You see, they are about a bear, they are about a herd of wolves. So that is certainly not going to prove that the homeland was North European. Moreover, hot climate animals are also attested, like the ape, the leopard, and even the elephant. Now, whereas hot climate countries have islands of cold climate, it is much harder to find islands of hot climate in cold countries. And you don't find an area of Norway where they have apes or where they have leopards. So this is a stronger linguistic paleontological argument. Mostly linguistic paleontology is not taken seriously anymore. It is treated as some experiment that they did in the 19th century and that has not been pursued since. However, in a few cases it is still valid. For example, in all Indo-European languages, you have about 6 different roots for different parts of the technology of a car. You have an axle, you have a wheel, you have a car. And so, the car meaning in Sanskrit a ratha. And that is very significant, because very likely it is the Indo-Europeans, at the time when they were still together, who invented the car, who first of all invented the wheel and then applied it in building a car. And personally, I speculate that that is the secret of their success. You see, after all, they conquered an area from Iceland to Bengal to Sri Lanka. That is quite impressive. Nobody else has done it. So the secret probably was the car. Because if a group of men on horseback conquer a country, very often they don't leave any linguistic trace. Take the Mongol conquests in the 13th century. They conquered from Poland to China, to Palestine, to the borders of India, and yet practically no territory of all those has become Mongolized. You know, Iran remained Iranian even though it was under Mongol domination. China remained Chinese. And in fact, it is the Mongols who were assimilated, not the Chinese. So, the difference is, if you have a car, you can take your family along. It's not a group of men who go on adventure and conquer some country and then disappear because they marry local women and linguistically lose their separateness. No, you see, when you take your family along, you can remain yourself, you can keep on having your own society, your own culture and so on, and so perpetuating your own language. Probably that is the secret of their success. At any rate, that is a trace we have to pursue. So their linguistic paleontology turns out to make sense. Now there are 2 examples that are very poignant for the homeland question. A fairly famous theorist for the Aryan Invasion Theory, Arnaud Fournet, argues at length and in great detail that the horse was foreign to the homeland. Usually, Indo-Europeanists have thought that the horse was the secret of the Indo-Europeans, that this is what allowed them to expand so sensationally. Well, Fournet says the horse was not present in the homeland. Okay, well, let's see what that implies. Where then must the homeland have been? Was it in Europe? No, because there's horses in Europe. Was it in Russia? No, because there's horses in Russia. And in Mongolia and in Afghanistan. You see, India, that is the part of the Indo-European expanse where there were natively no horses, where horses had to be imported. And even later throughout history, when they had kept horses in India, you find that battles between Central Asian invaders and Indian defenders were usually won by the invaders because they had better horses. Because Central Asia is the natural habitat of horses, India is not. Horses don't feel well in the Indian climate. So this leaves India as the homeland. Who had thought that? Then conversely, there is another animal that is present in only one part of the whole Indo-European expanse, namely India, and that is the elephant. And the elephant is definitely part of the Indo-European vocabulary. You find the word elephant or variations of it in a number of languages, including Latin and Greek, including even Germanic. You have a word ulbandhus, which is the same word as elephant, but it means camel. And there you can see when people went to Afghanistan, they lost the sight of elephants, but they plenty came into contact with camels, another big riding animal. So the word was transferred to this new species. So Shrikant Alagiri has a big paper about it, arguing that indeed, you see, the elephant is another argument why India must be the homeland. Then the isoglosses. An isogloss is a technical term of linguists, and it means a common change between different languages, but setting them apart from yet other languages. You see, if a language leaves the homeland, it is no longer in touch with the other speakers in the homeland or leaving the homeland in other directions. However, maybe the language that leaves the homeland will later split into different languages. And the changes they have gone through while being together remain in all the daughter languages. Let me give an example, because this might be difficult. The combination of two sounds kw, like in kwenkwe. In certain dialects of Indo-European, the first kw is dissimulated into p, and kwenkwe becomes penkwe. Or rather, the other way around. I'm sorry. So penkwe becomes kwenkwe. That's it. Okay. Penkwe becomes kwenkwe. Now, what do we see? In Latin, we find quinque, which means 5. And in Old Irish, we find koik, which also means 5. So the p has become qu. This indicates that Latin and Celtic have gone through a certain evolution together, so that after splitting from Proto-Indo-European, they went through some phases together, and only after that they split and became two different branches. So you indicate this by speaking of Italo-Celtic. Means that Italic and Celtic have a bit more in common than either of those two with all the other branches. So that is an isogloss, a common linguistic development. The famous one in the beginning of Indo-European studies, this was the decisive one, is between the words for 100, centum in Latin, or satem in Avestan in Iranian, or shata in Sanskrit. So what was k originally becomes sh or ch in some derived languages. So you have the original centum form in Hittite, Italo-Celtic, Germanic, Greek, and Tocharian. By contrast, you have the evolved form, k becoming sh or ch, in Baltic, Slavic, Armenian, Indo-Aryan, and Iranian. Now, the logical explanation of this is that this change took place in the homeland. You see, the old languages splitting off first and going their own way, they retained the old form, Kentum. In the heartland, in the meantime, Kentum changed over into Satem, and so the languages who left last take this newer form, this Satem form, and so they become Baltic, Slavic, and so on. Not coincidentally, they are the languages that moved away the least, that are closest to the heartland. And so the heartland could be anywhere in Slavic territory, Iranian or Indic territory. So this does not decide between the different homelands. You see, it could be Russia, it could be Afghanistan, it could be India. That all satisfies this criterion that the heartland should be Satem speaking. However, there is a language that has almost disappeared called Proto Bongani. It is spoken in India, in the foothills of the Himalaya, but it has remained a Kentum language. For example, you have a word for tear. Tear is in Indo-European dokru. Dokru is actually the origin of the English word tear. It's a bit much to explain, but the d becomes t in Germanic, and the k becomes h in Germanic. So you have tohr, and so that becomes tear. But in Sanskrit, it should have become dashru. The k should have become sh, and the o should have become ah. And so dokru should have become dashru. But it has not become dashru, dokru remains. So in the heart of India, you do have a leftover of a Kentum language. This, it is not entirely impossible that this language would have moved from Western Russia all the way to India in hot pursuit. After them came the Sanskrit speakers, but it is very unlikely. It is far more likely that this Kentum language was originally spoken in India, and that India is the heartland of the Kentum languages that left to Germany, to Italy, and so on, and that later became Satem languages like Sanskrit. But that you see in one corner of India, something of these Kentum languages has survived, namely in the form of Proto Bongani. As a famous journalist here in India, Girilal Jain, told me, nothing ever dies in India. And so this would be a beautiful example. Even the Kentum languages haven't died in India. Now, that is only a relatively frivolous example, a small example, interesting. More consequential is the following one. Greek, Armenian, and Indian, so west of Asia, Western Asia, Southern Asia, one continuous band, so to speak, south of the heartland, of the supposed heartland in Russia. They have a number of traits in common, a number of isoglosses. For example, you have the augment. In the past tense, Greek verbs as well as Sanskrit verbs get an addition in the beginning of a vowel. Like in Greek, you have the verb leipo. In the past, it becomes elipon. Leipo means to leave. Elipon, I left. Lego, to read. Elexa, I read. And so you have the same thing in Sanskrit, although the A has become A there. You have adhat, you have agamat, to go. So agamat, I went, or he went. So you don't have this in Russian, you don't have this in Germanic, and so on. It is only typical of those southern languages. Or for example, you have the word for don't, the word for prohibition, which is ma or me. You see, that has been added, that's new in these southern languages. It's a newcomer. doesn't exist in original Proto-Indo-European, and therefore it doesn't exist in Germanic, Hittite, and so on. Or you have the changeover from S to H, like for instance, sapta in Sanskrit becomes hafta in Iranian, hepta in Greek. So in this case, it doesn't concern Indo-Aryan, except a little bit, like for instance, the number 71 in Hindi. You have 70, which is sattar, but then 71 becomes ikhattar. So there too, the S becomes H. But you see, in Iranian and Greek, it is far more systematic, okay? Now, suppose that Russia had been the heartland. Then Iranian, which came into Iran through Afghanistan, would have had to go first to Afghanistan to the east, whereas Greek would have gone to the west. Or in the case of the augment, you see it is Greek but also Sanskrit. It is westwards as well as eastward. So whenever were those languages together after breaking away from Proto-Indo-European? Well, it is much easier if you locate the homeland in India. Because from India, Iranian, Armenian, and Greek went together. Only Armenian went a little bit farther after Iranian had stopped, and Greek went even more to the west. But so for a while they were together, and they developed changes together. So this is an argument against a Russian homeland in favor of an Indian homeland. So we have seen a number of linguistic arguments pleading in favor of an Indian homeland and certainly against a Russian or other more westerly homeland. This is not very strong evidence, it is not decisive evidence, but it all points in the same direction. So if you take the linguistic evidence seriously, the case for an Indian homeland has not exactly been proven, but is more likely than the case for a Russian homeland, let alone an even more westerly homeland. You have to take it, of course, in conjunction with archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, textual evidence, if there is any. But for what it is worth, the linguistic evidence somewhat supports an Indian homeland and definitely does not support the Aryan Invasion Theory. So it is a misconception among many Indians that we find no proof, but those linguists there, they have the proof. In fact, I can tell you confidentially, my own professor of Indo-European linguistics used to say to me, when I asked him, but is this proven, this Russian homeland? He said, well, we haven't proven it, but there is archaeological proof. So, you see, that is the case with the Aryan invasion. Very many people think that there is proof for the Aryan invasion, only it is someone else who has the proof. So, you see, you have no need to defer to this Aryan invasion theory as if this has a better evidence than an Indian homeland. The discussion as far as linguistics is concerned is still open, but rather favors an Indian homeland. Thank you.